Welcome to the latest webinar with Hired Power. We are very excited to be here today with two esteemed speakers, and the topic is eating disorders versus disordered eating. This is an in-depth conversation on eating disordered eating, and how to remove shame and make peace with food once and for all. We are here today first with Deidre, and Deidre serves as Hired Power's Chief Operating Officer. She brings with her a bachelor's degree in child and adolescent development and a master's degree in nursing leadership and education. And she's been in this field over 7 years in the field of addiction and behavioral health. And here at Hired Power, she works really closely with the leadership team to continue growing and developing our services through her skills and knowledge of addiction and behavioral health from a nursing perspective. And of course, just so we continue being able to provide the best possible service for all of you and your patients. Second, we are very excited to have Dr. Ross. And Dr. Carolyn Ross is an author, speaker, and expert, and she uses integrative medicine for the treatment of food and body image issues and addictions. She is CEO of the Anchor program, which is a non-diet online program for individuals with binge eating disorder, emotional eating, and food addiction. She is a certified eating disorder expert. She is a supervisor through IAEDP, and she's authored 3 books on eating disorders and is a contributing author of Treating Black Women with Eating Disorders, a Clinician's Guide. So you definitely have 2 experts here, and we're really excited to get this conversation going. Again, any questions, we are live here, so please pop them in the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many as possible. And with that, Deidre and Dr. Ross, I am excited to hand this over to you.
Thanks, Risa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I wanted to start first by saying I reached out into some community. I asked some people in our surrounding areas, what questions would you want to ask? What would you want to hear? And what's relevant to you right now? Because the goal of these webinars is to reach out to our community and to be a resource to the community in topics that are relevant today. And so eating disorders versus the disordered eating only sounded natural. And so question number 1 is going to be, what is the difference between an eating disorder and disordered eating?
That's a really great question, Deidre. I think many people wonder, and actually some people have said that America has an eating disorder. We can definitely say America has disordered eating because there's so much focus, particularly in our country, on size and shape and good foods versus bad foods and diets and so on. And, you know, it kind of snuck up on us when I first started in medicine. That wasn't the case. But since the decades that I've been in medicine, we've had demonized fat, then we demonized carbs, and then recently it's been sugar. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a whole bunch more. And I can't even list the number of diets that have been fads. So the question you're asking me, though, it's a little harder to parse out. From the medical standpoint, we have specific criteria that we use to diagnose an eating disorder, whether it be anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder, or some of the others. And so that's kind of a checklist that doctors and psychiatrists use to help them to diagnose. From the point of view of someone who's just a lay person, I think we have to look at things like behaviors. So if someone is restricting, in other words, not eating very much, if they're obsessed with what they eat or what they shouldn't eat and with their body size or shape, if their whole self-evaluation is dependent on the number on the scale, then that's when you should start being suspicious that they might have something more than just disordered eating. I'm not sure if that answers your question. What do you think?
I think that's great. I think that's a good, simple answer that hopefully everybody can understand.
Yeah.
So then, if you're feeling like maybe anybody listening today or anybody listening in the future that they know somebody maybe that struggles with disordered eating or maybe even the eating disorder, how do you talk to someone? How do you bring that conversation up?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and particularly from parents who have children who are struggling. I mean, we've talked about football players who are bulking up and then doing the cut, or people on the wrestling team, and women in girl sports like cheerleading or ballet. And there's a lot of worry, both from parents who are worried that their children are too heavy, to parents who are worried that their children aren't eating enough or eating too much. So I think the first thing that's most important for anybody concerned about a family member is just to recognize that if someone is struggling, what they're really needing is not judgment. It's not like you're a bad person because of fill in the blank. It's really acceptance and support. So how do we provide acceptance and support and not make it look like we're trying to control somebody or trying to force them to do something that we think is important that they haven't, come around to believing in? For example, the same thing goes with people with substance use disorders, like parents who worry, how do I get help for my kid? Well, the first thing is the kid has to want help, or at least be open to receiving help. And I think the same thing goes for eating disorders. But the first thing I would do is, if you're concerned, is to have a conversation. And again, parents are not always very good at these conversations because we want them to do what we think is right or what we think is healthy. And so we're trying to kind of make the conversation go in a certain way, when it should start more open-ended, like, I'm concerned about this, Sally, what I've noticed is, and then give very specific factual things that they've observed. I've noticed that you are always getting up immediately after eating and going to the bathroom and, to purge. I've noticed that you are moving food around on your plate, but you're not actually eating anything. I've noticed that you are eating large quantities of food when we, but not when we sit down to dinner. Maybe you're doing that in private. Or I have found food under your mattress, that you are hoarding, and so on. And so you look for things that can't be disputed. If someone says, well, I think that you're always worrying about how you look, that can be disputed. But when you look for facts, here's what I've observed. And then you express your concern. I'm concerned about that. And can we talk about it? Can you tell me what's going on? And leave that conversation open. Like, don't go into fighting with them, or you've got to do something, etc. But leave it an open-ended conversation that can come back to. And if you want help, I would really like to help you with this, and I can help you find a therapist, or blah, blah, blah.
That's so great. Thank you. I think that both with Dr. Ross being, such a vital person who is a huge wealth of knowledge, and then being able to wrap that service around of what all do you need? Is it inpatient treatment? Is it an outpatient therapist, as she spoke? Is it hospitalization? Is it someone in your home that's trained and working under clinical supervision to help you in the kitchen and having that healthy relationship and developing that healthy relationship with food? And so, that's where higher power comes in and supports as well. So I think it's absolutely amazing that we can partner in this piece.
And I think it's important to know that there are so many different ways to get treatment. In the past, when I first started, it was all residential or inpatient treatment, which is very, very expensive. But if a person doesn't need that inpatient or residential, there are so many, many options, and higher power definitely can help with those.
Yeah, great. So next, what behaviors, we spoke about children and we spoke about football players and, athletics, right? But what behaviors would parents look at in early childhood or adolescence that, you know, maybe would be a cause of concern for them?
Yeah, and I think this is another super important question. I remember when my granddaughter, who is now turning 22 in a couple weeks, when she was, I think in first or second grade, I picked her up from school, and she said to me, "Grammy, I'm going to go on a diet with my friends so I can fit into my bathing suit." And I was, you know, and I work in this field, obviously. First of all, I was shocked to hear that little girls that young were worried about fitting into their bathing suits, you know, like, I mean, that's a concept that hadn't crossed my mind in terms of my own family, and that they were planning to all go on a diet together. So now we know the studies are showing that, you know, kids as young as 3, 5 years old are talking about diets. They're worried about their bodies. They're afraid of gaining weight and so on. So I think this is a good question. On the other hand, though, we have so many parents who've read all these articles, who've been told by their doctors that, you know, if you are this size, then you can't be healthy. And so obviously from the medical point of view, you can be too thin. And I don't think from the medical point of view, there's really much evidence to support that living in a larger body is unhealthy. And this is something that most people do not know and can have a hard time accepting, because all of the articles you'll see, all of the posts on Instagram and Facebook are all about, wow, you know, some new way in which living in a larger body will make you unhealthy. COVID is the most recent example of that, where they are linking size to COVID. So I want to just put in a couple, I have to lay some groundwork here, Deidre, because this, as you know, I'm very passionate about this. So the studies that showed that there was any relationship between size and health, number one, most of them used body mass index, which was never designed to be used as a health marker, never designed for that. So that's number one flaw. The second flaw in the studies is that they assumed that being larger automatically made you less healthy. So that's another bias that makes those studies very flawed. And when you talk to people who are really researching these issues and looking very closely and deeply into them, the studies do not support that having a higher BMI makes you less healthy. So if a parent could start to get away from just being so alarmed if their child is, you know, a different size than they expect them to be, I think that's where you have to start. Because if you start with, okay, if she's bigger than her peers, or he's bigger than his peers, then there's a problem, and therefore I have to be on alarm. So that's the most important takeaway right there. And I think you've been through that. You mentioned something with your own son, right?
Yeah, being bigger than the other kids and having, you know, pieces of, you know, wanting to hide his food and go through looking, you know, feeling like he has to hide his food, like having shame around the food because attention is brought to it.
Yeah.
And then also with friends, he has a friend that's very large, right? And so his mom is very concerned, and Dr. Ross did a really great job saying he just lost his dad. So
yeah,
give him a break.
So, yeah, you're bringing up an important point that many times we don't look at the why, like why are kids either changing the way they eat, or why are they wanting to go on a diet, or why are they even wanting to compulsively exercise, which we all think is so great, but that in and of itself just can be part of an eating disorder. So we have to look at the why. And I remember I mean, you told me about your friend whose son had lost a dad, but I had a patient some time ago who was in Texas. He was a hefty guy and played football, and that was all big in Texas. So he was all good to go. However, when he was, I think in middle school, his mother died of breast cancer. And so he was left with his dad. And even though he and his dad were reasonably close, he lost that nurturing influence in his life, and he started gaining weight pretty rapidly. And so when we talk about a kid who's has changed in some way, how he's eating, whether he's hiding food or, hoarding food or overeating or any of that, you have to ask why. And some of that is normal. And so let's start with the kid who lost a parent. That's a normal adaptive response because kids don't have a lot of skills on how to deal with grief of that magnitude. I mean, just think about adults who've lost a parent. We have a hard time adapting to that. And if you're talking about a kid, that's an astronomical trauma for a kid. And so what we want to do, instead of focusing on their weight or that you found them hoarding food, is to focus on how can we support that kid in getting help with their grief. And if they're seeing a grief counselor, maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need to look at other things. And we also want to have more open conversations with them about how are you feeling about your dad's death? Or what else, what questions do you have? Or let me know if you're sad and we can work, we'll do work on that together. So in many families, when there's a death, what happens? Everybody just stops talking about it, or they talk about it for a while and then they think, oh, well, everyone should be over it. I mean, when I lost my son, who was 29, and people say, oh, we had him for 29 years. You know what? I could have had him for 59 years and that wouldn't have been enough for me, right? And so there is no timeline for grief, but I've heard many people say, oh, you should be over that, or he should be over that. So that is not the case. So number one, let's look for any underlying causes that are obvious. If there are no underlying causes. Number two, we need to recognize that children all grow at different, what do you call it? What's that S word? Not different timelines. Yeah. So in my son's fourth grade class, there was a girl who was already 5'3", and she looked like a giant compared to the other kids. But knowing her as she went into high school, she didn't grow another inch. So that's the kind of story that I get, where a girl comes and says, I was a giant in my fourth grade class and I just stopped eating to try to disappear or make myself smaller. I always tell the story about my youngest son, who was, when he went into middle school, we had to shop in the Husky department. I don't know, do they still have Husky?
Yes, they do. That's still a size.
Yeah. Well, when we were shopping in the Husky department, he said, Mom, does this mean that I'm fat? And, luckily for me, I knew the right answer to that. But I think many parents might be alarmed that their kids shopping in the Husky department. And as a matter of fact, one of my neighbors, who was a pediatrician, saw my son riding a little electric scooter and said to me, you should have him exercising because he's too heavy. Now, you can imagine how angry I got when someone said that to me. I almost popped him, but he was 6'4", so I probably couldn't have reached him. But anyway, I didn't follow through on all of that. I said to my son, no, you're not. You're bulking up to go through your growth spurt. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. He's over 6 feet tall and he's fine. Now, there are kids who have problems, like you mentioned with the child who's dad died. They may have a problem, but focusing on the weight only makes the problem worse. The weight and the eating behaviors are symptoms of the problem. They are not the problem. So it's just like if you went to the doctor with a sore throat and they said, oh, we'll give you an aspirin, but you really had strep throat. That's not going to cure your strep throat, right? You're going to need penicillin or one of those other antibiotics. So if you focus on the weight, then you make the weight the problem, and then it covers everything else up. And then I see them 30 years later, and they really do have problems because they've become bulimic or have binge eating disorder or whatever. So we also always want to recognize that often weight is a symptom of the problem. It's a way people are coping with the problem. It's not the problem itself.
That was great. Thank you. I feel like that was very enlightening.
That was clear?
Yes, I feel like that was very enlightening. And you guys and anybody watching, if you have questions, we want to do questions in real time. So please put them in the chat and we will answer them as they come up, because we want to make sure that all of your questions are addressed while we're here today.
I have a great one maybe we could start with.
Okay.
Is disordered eating on the anxiety spectrum?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Well, for all eating disorders, there's a high degree of anxiety disorders. It's not considered, eating disorders are not considered an anxiety disorder, but there is a strong correlation between anxiety disorders and eating disorders. And many times the anxiety disorder comes first, even before the symptom of the eating disorder. So if someone were to come into a program where I was the director, we always screen them for depression and anxiety, and we want to treat the anxieties so it doesn't become part of the problem. But yeah, that's a great question. And the same goes for people with substance use disorders. They need to be screened for depression, anxiety, etc.
Great. And here's one more great one. Is it common for entire families to suffer from the same eating disorder where kids seem to almost inherit it from being taught these eating patterns are normal while growing up?
Okay, now you're talking my language. That's a really interesting question. So first of all, there is a genetic component to eating disorders. If a close family member, like a parent, has anorexia, then the children, I think it's 12 times more likely to develop anorexia and 4 times more likely to develop bulimia. So there is a genetic component. And then there's the whole interesting conversation about intergenerational trauma, because all eating disorders, all people with eating disorders, there's a high risk that they have also had some childhood trauma. So and childhood meaning below the age of 18. So they've seen eating disorders and trauma go hand in hand. And, that's in men with eating disorders, women, and even children. All of those have a high rate of trauma. Now, we now know that the effects of trauma can be passed from one generation to another. In the old days, we thought, okay, well, if you have a mom who's anorexic, then she's not eating and she's, probably restricting your food. Then the way that impacts you is just because of her parenting, or it's what we call social learning theory. So you're just learning the behaviors of anorexia. But now we know that whatever trauma started your mom's anorexia, that also causes the gene for anorexia to be expressed. So that gene gets turned on in your mom. That gene for anorexia gets turned on. And then when you're born, you will have that turned on gene. So there's, just pure genetic, and then there's the impact of trauma on the expression of our genes, which can be passed from generation to generation. And we saw that starting way back in the 60s when they were studying offspring of Holocaust survivors. And they found that even though the children hadn't been in the camps, their children had higher risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, higher risk for depression and other traits if one or both parents were survivors of the Holocaust. And again, they thought, oh, well, it's just the parenting style is different. But newer studies that look at biochemistry and how our bodies deal with stress show that the genes that control stress are turned on such that people are often hyperactive to stress, and that then gets passed from generation to generation. And I can go into that. I mean, that's a whole long lecture right there, so I don't want to bore you, but if you have other questions about that, let me know.
That was great. That was a great question. Whoever asked that, thank you, Risa, for bringing that up, because that was very relevant. Do you see in all of this, we talk, and this could be, you know, adults, adolescents, or children, differences in gender, age, and athletics, like for kids who are participating in sports versus not participating in sports?
Do I see a difference in what?
Oh, the presentation of maybe problematic eating or that.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, there's a lot of misnomers or false facts amongst coaches, and they feel that, you know, that it's their job to help the student do well, and that's true. And often they will focus on size as a way to do that. And I think, I mean, I literally, Deidre, can't tell you how many of my patients who come into the Anchor program say to me things like, I was really athletic as a child, and I was playing soccer when I was 8 years old. And at the end of the season, the coach took me aside and said, you can't be on the team because you're too big. You know, I know Misty Copeland, the famous ballerina, was told over and over, you don't have the right body type for ballerina. And yet she's an incredible athlete and an incredible ballerina. So I think that needs a lot of education, because as a teacher or as a coach, you may not realize that something you say to a kid lasts for the rest of their lives. I mean, the woman I was telling you about with the soccer coach, when I saw her, she was almost 40. And this had happened when she was 8. So after the coach told her that, she just stopped exercising. It's like, okay, well, obviously, I thought I was an athlete, but obviously I'm not, because the coach said I'm not. And that caused a lot of problems for her in her life, you know, as you can imagine. So I think it's really important that coaches and teachers and anybody, pediatricians who has the care of children, start to educate themselves about health at every size, about the, you know, books that really talk about the truth about the lack of evidence to support the link between size and health. And one of the books I always tell people about, besides my own book, but this book is really good. It's by Tracy Mann. It's called Secrets of the Eating Lab. And she's been researching this very subject for, I think, probably 1 or 2 decades. And so she goes and analyzes all of the studies that have been done. And she tells you, okay, this is what this really means. And this is why this study is flawed. And this is what it means to you if you were to, you know, blah, blah, blah. So, and it's for lay people. It's not a scientific book, although she mentions a lot of research studies. But I don't think that people and parents and just in general realize the danger of continuing to harp and on size, of continuing to shame, especially children, about their size. We know even in adults who try really, really hard. I mean, the NIH study that lasted, it was, see, was it 10 years or 15 years, that looked at diet and weight loss and health. These people were monitored on a daily basis, and they were eating a prescribed set of diet. But to make a long story short, they lost 5% of their weight, and that's it. And that's about the average for any diet, if you look past the first 90 days. On the reverse, if we stop shaming people about their size, the studies show that people who are in larger bodies are more likely to choose foods that are healthy for them. They're more likely to be active if people were not judging them. If you imagine the life of someone living in a larger body who wants to go on a trip, who goes to the grocery store and someone stops her and shames her, who has children who are ashamed about their mother's size, and on and on and on. If you think about that, how could that be possibly helpful? You cannot shame somebody thin. If we had a pill that could make everybody thin, that's great, but we don't. We don't even have a decent treatment, and there is no real problem. We're making a problem where there isn't one. So.
Yeah, I did my master's thesis on it's just as hard to be Ken as it is to be Barbie, and bringing attention to adolescent male body image dysmorphia and eating disorders. And, mind you, my master's degree was done, maybe 10 years ago, but I see now that topic is so relevant, where when I did that topic, I did it based on what I was seeing in my two brothers playing sports. Yeah. And that's what brought the relevancy to me. And there wasn't a lot of research out there. So I had to go to other, areas and international places to find the research that had been done, because they had done the research. We had not done the research here in the United States as relevant or prevalent. And just the presence, they were even talking about social media 10 years ago. And what did we even really have as social media? And so looking at, they said sports and being an athlete and using, supplements and using all these different things kind of added to the likelihood that you would see problematic weight gain, weight loss, disordered eatings, but they didn't call it disordered eating 10 years ago either, eating disorders in the future when they moved away from being the athlete.
Right, exactly. Because many people have food and body image issues, use exercise to kind of keep them stable, and extreme exercise is not something that can be sustained throughout the lifespan. It just isn't. If you're working out 5 hours a day as a teenager or a young adult, your body can probably handle that, but it's not going to work when you're 40. You're not going to have 5 hours in your day unless all you do is exercise and go to work. So,
right. Yeah, it is so relevant now, like what you looked at it and you're like, oh, this is a topic that interests me because of this, but where's it really going? And then now today it's everywhere.
Yeah, and the increase in eating disorders in males is really, it's going up, and more people are coming in for treatment. So that's good, but there's a lot of shaming and weight with males, not nearly as much as there is for females, but it's still an issue. Yeah.
Right. And then, so we're talking about shame. So, and you've talked a lot about taking the shame away. So what are some ways that you would recommend to parents or to the coaches or the teachers to pull that shame away? Because sometimes they've been shamed, right? So you talk about again, also the background of where they've come from, their parents, their coaches. How do they, if they only know that shame-based approach, and they don't see it that way, maybe. How do you recommend they pull themselves away from that shame-based approach?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to change, especially in the coaching field, because there's coaching for many people has been sort of abusive anyway. You know, they yell at the team. I mean, when my son was in rugby, I saw that all the time. The things that the coach would yell, I was just like, wow, that would demotivate me. But they saw that as motivating. So that's part of their culture that needs to change. And I think there are more and more women going into coaching and into being sports assistants. I'm not sure what you call it on the field that's helping that. But the main thing to realize is that you cannot make someone's body conform to your ideal. So our goal for children shouldn't be to look like someone else, to look like a neighbor or a teammate. Our goal for our children should be to look the best they can be, given their genetics, given anything else that maybe their trauma, you know, to do the best you can. And the only way you can do that is by recognizing them for all the other components that make them who they are besides their size. Like why parents have focused on size over and over and over in the decades I've been in medicine has, you know, been heartbreaking to me. Because here you may have a child who I'm seeing as a teenager or a young adult or a 40-year-old was somebody's child and they were shamed. And instead, if you had given them the gift, the one gift that is the most important thing you can give a child, which is acceptance and encouragement to be the best they can be. So acceptance looks like, you know, well, it doesn't mean, oh, you did everything good. Like all of these young teams that are giving trophies when people don't win. I'm not a fan of that. I'm a big fan of telling the truth to children. Like, did you do your best today? If you did, that's great. That's what we're looking for, you doing your best. But also not having all of the dinner table conversations focused on what you're eating and whether you exercise. I've had parents tell kids, you can't have dessert until you go and work out for 30 minutes or whatever. Stop doing that. That is hurting your children. Start giving them recognition for the things that they do well and encouraging them on the other things that you would like to support them in. But give them acceptance. Acceptance is the key to self-esteem. Self-esteem is the key to healthy living.
Great. Thank you. So we have a question that came in.
Oh, yes, you're going to get to that one.
I will read it. Is that okay?
Justin? Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. So just playing devil's advocate. I love devil's advocates. You said there's no problem. We're making a problem. If there is a physiological health problem, psychological health problem, it is physiological, that have known, I'm going to say have known at causes that is directly related to increased weight. Can you explain how it's not a problem? Physiological health problems.
We don't know of physiological problems that are directly related to weight. You've been told that they are, and I'm being devil's advocate because once you really look at the newer research and once you analyze the old research, as Tracy Mann did in her book, you realize that it is not weight that causes diabetes. It's not weight that causes heart disease. Weight and diabetes they run together in the same track, but maybe we should start, because we know from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that trauma increases dramatically the risk for substance use disorders, for increased size by BMI, for anxiety, depression, for diabetes, for heart disease. Trauma increases the risk for diabetes and heart disease. So maybe we should start asking our patients and doing universal screening to see whether our patients who are struggling with diabetes have a history of trauma and help them heal from their trauma instead of focusing on this other issue, which has not been proven to cause diabetes. It has only been shown to be associated with diabetes. When we look at COVID, we know, for example, that BIPOC individuals, Black, Indigenous people of color, died disproportionately higher from COVID. They also have disproportionately higher rates of diabetes, for example. And interestingly enough, disproportionately higher rates of childhood trauma, of historical trauma, and intergenerational trauma. So we need to stop. I mean, come on, it would be great if we had a treatment that for this non-disease, which we're calling, weight, but we don't. All we have is self-righteousness, like, well, I haven't gained weight. Well, you're just lucky. That's all. Maybe you didn't have childhood. Maybe you weren't raped when you were 5 years old. But 99.9% of my patients who come to the anchor program, not to lose weight, but to learn how to accept themselves, have experienced pretty significant trauma. And I just think the superficial nature of our culture is killing people. It really is.
Thank you. All right, next question from Catherine. Are there types of therapy that have been proven to be more effective for eating or disordered eating, DBT, CBT, EMDR, etc.? And related to the previous question about therapy, can you comment on the view by many participants that eating disorder programs can often make clients worse as they learn behaviors from each other and how to consider those risk downsides?
I'll answer the second one first. I've never seen that in any reputable eating disorder program. So, eating disorder patients are very, very smart and clever and know, anything they need to know is online. There are all these pro-ANA websites that give you detailed instructions on how to be an anorexic. So I don't think that's the case. You always want to look for a reputable, well-known eating disorder treatment center, and Hired Power has done tons of great, referrals of people they've worked directly with. And the same when I was working in treatment centers and had to refer. I only referred to centers that I knew for a fact were good. So now I've forgotten the first question, so you're going to have to give it to me again.
That's okay. Are there types of therapy that have been proven to be more effective for disordered eating, CBT, DBT, EMDR, etc.?
Okay, so if we start with the recognition that trauma is the underlying cause of eating disorders and substance use disorders, then the first thing we want to be aware of is that trauma affects how people deal with stress. And it can cause hyperactivity of the stress system, which then also causes emotional dysregulation. So I want you to know what you're treating, because when we focus only on treating the behaviors, like we're going to force the anorexic to eat, we're going to keep the person with binge eating disorder from binging, or any of those things, it's not going to get to that root cause. So the therapies we need to address trauma, and not just be trauma informed. They need to be providing well-known, documentedly effective trauma therapies. They need to have therapists who are trained in trauma work. Then we need to also help people regulate their emotions. And that's where your DBT comes in, your CBT comes in, and so on. And then we work on behaviors and educating people about nutrition and helping them restore or recreate their relationship with food and their body. So I just like to look at it from the point of view of what the causes are, and then let's address those deeper causes, and then we can work on behaviors from there.
So I have another question that came in on my phone, and I am assuming it's going to fit into this recommendation around figuring out the cause, but how to treat binge eating and what binge eating looks like, when you're trying to work with someone who is struggling with that.
Yeah. The Anchor program that I run, the online program, works with people with binge eating, food addiction, and emotional eating. And I use that same approach that I just mentioned to you of helping people get to the root cause of why they're struggling with binging, why they're struggling with body image, etc. And again, not focusing on the weight, because the weight isn't the problem, the weight is the solution. Helping them to heal from whatever traumatic experiences they've had, at the same time that we help them learn new skills to deal with stress and their emotions, where they don't have to always use food. So you have to really have compassion that people have developed behaviors as a way, usually when they were children and had no other options, of dealing with some kind of event. Like we were saying, the kid who lost his dad. What can a kid do? How can they? I mean, they can cry, but boys are told not to cry. What else do they have as a skill besides using food to comfort themselves? So I think there are many, many children who go through tough. I mean, I work with military guys, and some of those guys come from some of the most traumatic childhoods I've ever seen. How do they then, how do people like that who are children and have been traumatized deal with those trauma? Many times with food, also with substances, including cigarettes, sex addiction, gambling, etc. So we have to have some compassion for people and recognize that they're doing the best they can, and they have been since childhood, usually.
Great, thank you so much. So are there any other questions coming in? Otherwise, I have another question.
Let's go with yours for now. And anyone else, if you have any questions, this is the time. Please put them in the Q&A or the chat here so we can get to them. All right.
Yes. Okay, so question is, which I think a lot of people want parenting classes for a lot of things, but are there any parenting classes that you recommend for people whose children are struggling with healthy eating or exhibiting the unhealthy lifestyle choices early on?
Well, you should be able to talk to your pediatrician, but I know from experience that not all of them are educated about this. My best response is no, there are no parenting classes. There are no parenting classes on hardly anything, but certainly not on eating disorders. If you want me to start one, get together a group of people, I'm happy to do that because I think it's important. But again, the best thing you can do for your child, even if you're worried about them, is to be nurturing, to give them acceptance, and to give them praise for the things that do make them who they are. Like, not everybody's going to be skinny. Not everybody's going to be a famous NFL football player, and and so on and so forth. So you may have aspirations for your child, but after raising 3 children, I can tell you they almost never follow your aspirations. I was hopeful with my 3rd and final kid that he was going to go into science and he wanted to be a sports medicine doctor. And I was like, yes, finally. And then after 1 semester of chemistry, he changed to, journalism, and then to the fashion industry and all over the place. So now he's a music producer in Los Angeles, and that seems to be clicking. But that, if I had said, oh, what would I like? I mean, really the best answer is, I would like to be supporting my child in what they are best at, instead of, saying, oh, well, they're not eating enough carrots, so they must have an eating disorder, or they've gained, 5 pounds, so they must have an eating disorder. Just be cautious, because children are evolving so rapidly, and you don't want them to be stuck in a place where someone in their family told them that there was something wrong with them, because that lasts a lifetime. Even an implication of that lasts a lifetime.
Great, thank you. So yeah, anybody needs parenting classes, let's get a group together. Because I feel like that's one thing so many people need, is how, you take a class to drive your car, you take a class to do everything, and you don't take a class to have a kid or have tough conversations with a kid. And so you use your background, right? What you learned and what you were taught or told, unless you read a lot of books. And then you maybe are putting your unhealthy beliefs or biases then onto your children, who then in turn will change that. So it's a nasty loop sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So if there are no other questions, did I not ask anything, Dr. Ross, that maybe you did want to address while we're on this webinar?
Yeah, I think when we talk about parents and children, I think the pose should be, give your children what you consider, to the best of your ability, a healthy diet, and allow them to eat what they want to eat. Don't force them to eat. Don't force them to clean their plate. We've had generations of clean your plate. There are people starving in Africa, China, wherever the fad was back then. But allow them to eat what their body tells them to eat. And then just observe and allow that to be. Now, obviously, if you have concerns, then you want to consult an expert, but you really need to, unfortunately, consult an expert who has an eating disorder background, if that's what you're talking about. And sadly, most physicians have never been trained in nutrition and have very little training in eating disorders. So if you have available to you any kind of, therapist in your community, child therapist who has an eating disorder background, and that, on my name, you'll see CEDS. That means Certified Eating Disorder Specialist. And the group that gives you that certification has a list of dietitians and therapists and so on who have been trained in eating disorders, and they have to go through the certification process. So that's a great resource because it's international. And that group is called IADP. So it's IAEDP, International Association of Eating Disorder Professionals. And they will have a list of people who have that CEDS. I think for dietitians, it may be CERD, I'm not sure, but they have a list of people who've been certified. So if you have a question and you want to know if your kid's doing okay, I'd rather you take them to a certified eating disorder dietitian than even to the pediatrician, because many of them have not had sufficient education in that area. And again, use higher power. They have resources as well. So that's what I would do, rather than trying to force your kid to eat something or not eat something. Educate yourself by going with them to the person who's a specialist, and let them get educated, and that'll stand them in good stead.
Great, thank you for that resource. That's really great.
Yes.
Brittany Johns wrote in Inspired Resolutions Counseling offers a free parenting class, and this practice does specialize in teens and SUD and disordered eating as well. And also run a free young women's group. That eating disorder comes up a lot in this group. She works at the Hoag Chemical Dependency Unit as well as this. So if anybody needs anything, it's inspiredsolutionscounseling.com. So
Thank you, Brittany. That's
it's
so
great
much,
to
a lot of-
find the resources that are local to us.
Yes. Well, this has been amazing. Just to wrap this up, someone's been listening right now. You know, they got a lot of knowledge. What is the first step? What do they do first from here?
If they have a problem, you mean, or?
Yeah. If they have a problem, or if one of their loved ones has a problem.
Well, I think call you guys and you can refer, if it's appropriate, you can refer to me or to someone else in your network. I also, as you know, I've written 3 books, one on binge eating, one on emotional eating, one on food addiction. I'm offering a free copy of the Food Addiction Recovery Workbook. I pay for the book. You just pay a small handling or shipping fee. So that's what I would do. You have to start somewhere, and I trust the people at Hired Power. They're not going to do something that would harm you or even be without good reason. So
Yeah.
Well, that's really
Yeah.
helpful. So we will give the link to Dr. Ross's book. As a reminder, you know, I just posted the phone number for Hired Power. You can call us anytime, 24/7, 365 days a year. We are here, and we can definitely help point you in the right direction. And
if anybody's interested in my program, go to anchorprogram.com and you can get a free consult with me if you want to talk about your individual food and body image issues.
perfect.
Great.
I will pop that in here as well. And we look forward to sending out the recording so that maybe you could share this with anyone else who it might help support. And we really wish you all, we're sending positive energy your way, whatever you're dealing with, whether it's you, a loved one, a client, a colleague,
It's a tough issue. It's a tough issue.
It's a tough issue, but there are resources to help you. And Dr. Ross is one of them, and Hired Power is one of them. So don't lose hope. I'm really glad you all made it. That's the most important part. So thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon at another webinar. And please have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much, Dr. Ross and Deidre,
Very
for all.
Yes, you guys have a great day.
Thanks, Risa. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.